We will now end our symposium with closing remarks by Dr. Colin McEwan, who is Director of Pre-Columbian Studies at Dumbarton Oaks Research Library and Collections, Washington, D.C. Dr. McEwan specializes in the art and archaeology of the pre-Columbian Americas and has carried out fieldwork in diverse settings ranging from the Peruvian highlands, Upper Amazon, coastal Ecuador, and Patagonia. From 1979 to 1991, he directed the Agua Blanca archaeological project focused on a major Manteño settlement in the Machalilla National Park, coastal Ecuador. He was formerly head of the Americas section at the British Museum in London, where he authored or co-edited numerous exhibition publications, including Pre-Columbian Gold Technology, Style and Iconography, Unknown Amazon Culture in Nature in Ancient Brazil, Turquoise Mosaics from Mexico, El Caribe Precolombino, Ancient America's Art in Detail, and Moctezuma, Aztec Ruler. He is particularly interested in reconstructing and interpreting the roles that objects play in prehistorical cultural landscape. Dr. McEwan.
Well, a very good afternoon, everyone. We're at that stage in the day where we've absorbed as much water as we can, and we have to go in search of chicha, I think. If you'll bear with me, I'll make some brief closing remarks for those of you that are here, and begin simply by saying that it's this kind of conversation among specialists and non-specialists alike that is the very essence of trying to prepare a thoughtful exhibition. It's an enormous task, and the task involves trying to learn what has come out, for example, of today's presentations and conversations, and how these can be applied to the exhibition. In other words, what are the instructive narratives that can help speak to a much broader audience, and the fact that non-specialists have been present today makes all the world of a difference there in articulating the academic research to make it relevant to not only Native American populations throughout the Americas, particularly in the Andes, but also to a new generation coming up who wonders, or may wonder, what can we learn from all of this? Well, in the first place, there are, and let me get the hang of this here if I can, Ronald. What is?
Just move forward with this.
That's forward, that's great.
There.
Great, thank you so much. So you'll see I've titled this Engineering Ingenuity. And we've seen proof positive of incredible ingenuity applied in very different settings and in different media. And the sub-question is really, to what end? To what end is this deep knowledge of material, of landscape, employed? That's the question that will underlie my closing remarks here. But perhaps the first lesson to learn is the nature of empire. And you've already seen earlier graphics showing a shrunken empire. What if Europeans had arrived 100 years earlier? What if they had arrived 200 years earlier? What would they have made of the Andean world at that point? And we have to remember that the way we look back on the archaeology of empire, we tend to draw a kind of, if you'll forgive the analogy, a kind of Hadrian's wall around the Inca Empire, as if it was a static and accomplished entity. And of course, we know full well that that wasn't the case. The very nature of empire is process. And what we've learned a lot today is about insights into the fine detail of these processes that helped build empire. Empire as a dynamic adaptation emerging from a relatively circumscribed area in the Andes and exploding in all directions, north, south, somewhat limited to the east and even more limited to the west by the Pacific Ocean. I like to think that we can adopt two perspectives on the engineering accomplishments, always asking that question, to what end? In the first place, we know because of this explosive expansion that the period that the Incas themselves had to work in the Inca heartland was relatively limited, but it was certainly at perhaps 100, 150 years, if you're an optimist, longer than the Incas had to apply their architectural signature, which was modifying the landscape to make it more productive, to facilitate movement. That the time span available for doing that was much smaller at the margins of empire. And that really leads us into some of the core lessons that we've seen from today's presentations, where if we think of the intensive modification of the landscape, it's most evident in the Inca heartland. We've seen wonderful presentations from Ken and Ruth speaking to the integrated management of stone and water. These two fundamentally opposed but intimately related elements. Stone as intractable as you can get, but the Incas managed and worked with it almost as if it was a plastic medium. And by the same token, the Incas also understood that water sustains all life, but has great destructive potential. And at Machu Picchu itself, we can, and indeed in Christine and her team's presentation, we understand that the Incas learned by observing and adapting. It's a universal lesson. If you understand the landscape that you're in and the factors that affect it, and you respond to that, then you can manage that landscape in such ways that you have an enduring outcome. Of course, the buzzword is sustainability. But if you can cope and manage with water, if you can build successfully in stone to withstand earthquakes, then you have something that is enduring, and as the speakers have already pointed out in answer to some of the excellent questions, yes, we have lessons to learn from that. Not simply because things are functional. The management of water, of course, at one level is manifestly functional, but at a larger level, there is an aesthetics involved here. And that's what is the compelling attraction, one might say, to understanding Inca culture, understanding what the Incas did and why they did it. Now, I'm, courtesy of colleagues, using one or two slides here to illustrate some of the points I'll be making and touching upon what the speakers have contributed. We've heard about the relationship between the roads and the surrounding landscape and productive agricultural terrain as opposed to the intervalley high grasslands, which are an extraordinary and challenging environment, along, of course, with the precipitous mountain slopes, all of which the Incas incorporated into an integrated economy. It's sometimes not realized that what the Incas really did, and of course this as one of our speakers has pointed out, began with Wadi and with Tiwanaku before, and even deeper than that. One even has to look at least well back into the first millennium at Chavin de Wantar. Those of you who have visited Chavin and understand the engineering and the construction of that site, who have looked at firsthand at Tiwanaku, will know that the Incas were building on the shoulders of giants. But what the Incas did in terms of ecology was begin to open up a whole new niche. That is the steep and hitherto very difficult to cultivate slopes of valleys and mountains. They made extraordinary progress on that, most noticeably in the Urubamba Valley. But how much more that could have been extended, one can only imagine, if the Inca Empire had continued. The management of water, of course, is most apparent in the way that these terraced slopes at Pisac and everywhere else are successfully irrigated without being washed downslope into the valley. We've lessons to learn from that. And those of you who know in Machu Picchu intimately will know that there was also an aesthetic and reverential treatment of water, such that the channel that comes in from the Inca Road into the site is then led through the very core of the ceremonial city itself, through a series of basins and then led out at the bottom. It's as if the designers of Machu Picchu built water into it, respectfully and reverentially, as well as functionally. We have learned in other media from John Oschendorf and Gary Urton about how quipus and rope bridges were instrumental in every sense of the word to administering the state bureaucracy. It would be easy to say that it helped tie together all the knots, but you have to think how functionally effective the Inca administrative bureaucracy was, and how essential the quipu was to that. In parallel with that, what was generating this distilled knowledge? What was the mechanism for gestating visionary ideas? And of course, all roads in this sense lead not so much to Rome, but to Cusco. And this map, along with the ones that Ricardo and Jose have presented today, are fleshing out the picture in terms of how Cusco, as a capital of empire, worked. It's no longer just an abstract 4 roads that lead to the 4 quarters of the empire. We're suddenly seeing the detailed infrastructure, and this is just the roads, of course. It was paralleled by the prescient management by canalization of water to convert the Cusco Valley into the productive agricultural base that it offered, as well as the administrative base for the empire. Ricardo and Jose gave us this wonderful, tantalizing illustration of how digital technology helps us start to reimagine the 3-dimensional architectural space. Some of us wondered over lunch about the domed reconstruction of Muyumarca, and questioned whether it should not rather have had a much steeper pitched roof. I wonder myself how they're conceptualizing the Ushnu, or should we say the Ushnus, plural, in Cusco. There's a lot of confusion archaeologically about what the Ushnu is and what it represents within Andean cosmology, as well as specifically within Inca architecture, Inca definition of space. A real insight into it understands the Ushnu as a vertical orifice into which water and moisture can drain. And so by preserving this, you could say symbolic, but also very practical and not to say sacred element in the Haukaipata, the Incas, just as they did at Machu Picchu, were playing with these elements of circulation, visible circulation in the form of water, as well as the way that that represents, one can say, the circulation of energies in an animate landscape. We've had wonderful examples as well of the expansion of the road system. And just to close my comments here, I want to try and point again to complement everything we've learned about the engineering today to what I would now refer to as the extensive, as opposed to the intensive modification and appropriation of landscape to turn it towards productive ends. If we look at the early stage of Inca expansion, it's basically into the high Puna grasslands to the west and to the north of Cusco. And the great productive capacity and wealth, the economic wealth that the camelid herds represented there. In looking at this illustration here, of course, it reminds us that even as the early Spanish chroniclers were observing this extensive landscape, they were getting a very partial picture of it, because by that stage it had become a largely depeopled landscape. And somehow, if in our imaginations, in our practice, and not least, we hope in the exhibition, the challenge will be to bring the people back into the center of the picture. This is an Inca road leading up into the high grasslands, where I've been working with a team of colleagues over the last 4 to 5 field seasons in the Puna grasslands surrounding the Ayacucho Basin. And I'll touch very briefly in going through this on something that hasn't quite been addressed within the body of the presentations today, and that is what is up there. Gary's already shown this illustration here of the system of roads through the high Puna grassland. They are not as well, you could say, engineered as some of the major trunk roads, if I can call them that. Shall we call it the Intersuyu system as opposed to the interstate system? But nevertheless, there's a clear hierarchy between the main roads and the dendritic network of secondary and tertiary paths and trails. But what is up there? This is labeled as Apachita or Apacheta. I know it's a bit difficult to see at a distance. And yet it's not just a heap of stones. It's a tiered, constructed platform beside the road. These were described by Gary as possibly way stations or tambos, or representations of tambos for the chasquis. But actually what you find is that structures like this, chulpas, exist in the landscape. The apachitas are certainly there, but they're only one element in what, if I could use a British analogy, is really like a Neolithic landscape. There's all manner of constructions high up here in the high grasslands. And it's the Kapak Nyan project that has been instrumental in bringing this now into purview. And in particular, our colleague at the University of Huamanga, Cirilo Vivanco Pomancanchari, who is an inveterate walker of these landscapes. And we are just beginning to discover and understand them. The other illustration from the early chronicler Marua, and the two versions illustrated of versions of his manuscript that have come into scholarly purview in the last 20 years, the Galvin manuscript in Ireland and the Wellington manuscript in the Getty, have given new visual insights because we have a very limited visual corpus. And here we see towers represented again as built constructions, and they're labeled as saiwas, sometimes even standing on, as it were, three legs here. And in some of our work, we come upon a great number of saiwas. Here's a group of 3 here. There's an underlying question: why are they grouped? What do the groups represent? What relationship do they have to the great regional mountain deities, the Apus on the horizon? And they, for all the world, if you have a little imagination and talk to local informants, can appear as lithified ancestors, this relationship between the world of stone and the living world. High up in these mountaintops, we found a whole new category of Inca structures, from well over 4,000 meters on upwards. They lie in a kind of, you could say, almost an intermediate category of high-altitude structures, not as high as the Capacocha burials are found above the snow line. But this is one example of a dressed stone platform, the highest dressed stone architecture in the Americas. This is my colleague Frank Meddens, and this is Inka Pirka Waminan. And here begins another whole story for it's 3 meters below the surface here. In an excavated basin, stone basin in the bedrock, we found 3 revered stone objects placed in here, corresponding to the descriptions that the chroniclers gave of revered stone objects that they observed in Cusco. One such object was said to be the image of the sun that the common people worshipped. Other descriptions tell how when the Inca was traveling, a dressed stone object was placed on the tiana, the wooden seat upon which the Inca sat to stand in as his stone brother in his absence. And there are also descriptions in the chroniclers of stone objects in laminated gold. So around Inka Pirka Waminan, and I won't go into this in detail, but there's a whole cultural landscape around here. The Apacheta, in fact, marked here by a triangle, is, and it's a series of apachetas, is some distance from the actual platform here. All of these Inca stone platforms, and they're definitively Inca platforms, do not have a shred of cultural debris around them. It's as if it was absolutely prohibited to contaminate the site with any cultural debris. All one can find is a few formative, archaic obsidian flakes and arrowheads, if you have a sharp eye. What these platforms represent, really, are an affirmation of imperial hegemony. The Incas' attempts to begin to dominate a foreign territory altitudinally. And the Inca road system, of course, was an integral part of that. The platforms are a kind of architectural signature of the Inca presence. Some of them even have evidence of ceremonies involving water and liquids on top, and many are filled with rich, layered agricultural soils. So this extension, this extensive attempt to begin the process of appropriating new landscapes, new territories from the eastern flank of the Andes to the desert coast, the search for metals in the south, the search for spondylus princeps in the north here. This is an empire that is dynamic. And it's my earnest hope that as the exhibition starts to proclaim the engineering accomplishments of Andean culture, Andean civilization, exemplified in the Incas, that we can also bear in mind the larger cultural questions that lie behind this drive to expand. These are universal questions. Why do empires do what they do? What makes them succeed? Are they different? What do they hold in common? What can we learn from them? Why do they fail? Ultimately, where the roads run out, you get these monster mountains, Aconcagua, Cerro El Plomo, Jujajaco, Ampato, Cerro Mercedario here. Here, Johann Reinhardt has found evidence of the Inca presence right the way up close to the summit at unimaginable altitudes. So the roads are part of the story, an essential part of the story. Water and stone plays a part, but it's all embedded within Andean cosmology. And today I feel we've taken another wonderful step in understanding many different aspects of that. Warm congratulations to the speakers for everything that they've brought, and to everyone here for hanging on in there. Thank you.